people
Yeah.
joining, but we'll get started as they join. So thank you for that, Charlotte. Thank you very
Good.
much.
No problem.
So morning, everybody. So as a quick introduction, my name's Alison Smith. I am CEO and also a lead consultant at Roots Human Resources, and I'm going to be taking you through this webinar today around avoiding unconscious bias in interviewing. So unconscious biases, and obviously we're going to sort of delve into that a little bit more, but they can sort of hopefully inadvertently creep into our sort of hiring processes, and that can potentially lead to unfair or sometimes unintentional discrimination. So in this webinar, we're going to look at what do we mean by unconscious bias, how does it sort of, or could it materialize in interviewing, and how do we mitigate that? So unconscious bias can happen in all stages of recruitment and selection. So it could be, writing the initial job description, advertising, shortlisting, etc. But the focus of today's session is going to be around the interview and trying to mitigate that kind of unconscious bias creeping into interviews. So for those of you who are sort of new to us, I'm going to introduce Roots HR. So we are a specialist consultancy for HR in the social sector. We've been running for about 15 years now. We are a social enterprise ourselves, and we're the sort of only HR consultancy in the UK where we use our trading surpluses to provide pro bono or free HR services, including sort of learning and development to leaders and managers in the social sector. So that's why we're here today offering you this this webinar, and we sort of banner that under our academy. So this is all part of the Roots HR Academy. So we're really pleased to have you all with us today. And I'll do it at the end as well, but just a quick plug, please do have a look at our website if you haven't engaged and seen the sort of quantity and type of free resources that we have available on there as well. So as we said, today's session, we're going to look at, sort of define a little bit about unconscious bias and differentiate it from sort of conscious bias or discrimination. Explain through that how our brains might use things like stereotypes or shortcuts to make certain judgments, which can potentially then lead on to bias. Then we'll look at what are some of the common types of unconscious bias in interviews, obviously look at the negative impact that that can have for organisations. And then we'll look at some sort of strategies around mitigating that, that unconscious bias. And obviously this approach, when we're talking about avoiding unconscious bias in interviewing, this applies as much to when you're recruiting volunteers, including things as trustees, as it does to when you're recruiting employees. So all of this kind of guidance is relevant for any kind of situation where you're interviewing an individual for a role or perhaps even the provision of services. So as we said, in terms of unconscious bias, when we think about the brain, always sort of think about it a little bit like an iceberg. There's things going on at the top of the iceberg, which are typically where we're doing some of our conscious thought, but there's a massive unconscious part of the brain, the iceberg bit that's under the sea, that's making some of these shortcuts, as I've referred to enable you to sort of make quicker decisions, judgments. And I anticipate, I'm not fully conversant in this, but I anticipate that some of that spills back to, the time of sort of having to make fight or flight decisions, so shortcuts to enable us to make kind of snap decisions. So just very quickly pop this slide up, saying that obviously most of our processing of information takes place in the unconscious part of our brain. And these decisions are typically based on associations we've made, or through sort of previous experiences. So something like the slide, hopefully you all read that very, very quickly, just simply says, can you read this? But obviously it's spelled incorrectly. But the perception being that actually your brain, when we're reading, it doesn't necessarily read every single letter to then create the words that you're seeing on the page. It takes shortcuts, and based on your experience of reading in the past, it will identify letters and patterns to kind of create your understanding of what that sentence is. So even though that's spelt incorrectly, letters are in the wrong way, you can still very quickly read that sentence because it's words that you are used to and familiar with seeing. But these sort of decisions or judgments, we might refer to them, unconscious biases, are things like gut instincts. We might say those gut instincts can be very helpful when we need to make decisions that sort of rely on learned experiences, and gut instincts can be very helpful in some situations, but obviously the assumptions that we have that might inform those gut decisions are sort of developed every day through our sort of interactions with other people, as well as what we see, if we think TV, film, what we hear through radio, what we read, and our experiences. So unconscious biases, or those kind of gut decisions, might not necessarily be helpful when decisions center around people, as they can be influenced by our assumptions rather than sort of real evidence. So whilst we might think that gut instincts are useful to us, and they can be in some circumstances, when those decisions that we're needing to make are centered around people, that's when some of the decisions can be potentially influenced by our assumptions rather than sort of evidence. So these are known as sort of unconscious bias. And I'm going to move on to the next slide just to show some sort of further examples of these. So mental shortcuts. So if somebody enters the room and we think about it, it could be that our subconscious assumptions and judgments that we make about people are going to be based on perhaps limited information or personal experiences. So that kind of initial judgment that we might make about somebody when they've entered that room could be based on our previous experiences of somebody who may, have dressed the same, have had the same hairstyle, be of the same skin color. So we're potentially making those initial judgments, assumptions on a person, using those mental shortcuts because we're making assumptions based on previous experience that we've had to perhaps inform our initial thinking about an individual. Implicit association. These are associations that affect our sort of choices and decisions, and they're really the result of perhaps both conscious and unconscious mental processes. For example, research will suggest that when people have been asked about overweight individuals and their capacity to be an effective employee, most people would say, oh, well, actually, I don't think that weight is relevant to a particular job performance. However, if there were a test of your unconscious attitudes about weight and competence, that might reveal that actually you do have a bias, and you may have a negative association between somebody's weight and their ability to perform well in a role, or their attendance at work. So this means that you can kind of make a false belief or assumption about somebody. And sometimes we will refer to that in sort of everyday language as sort of stereotyping. And obviously that can all lead to discrimination. And in terms of conscious thought, this sort of boundary between unconscious bias and conscious discrimination. So conscious discrimination would require conscious thought to treat somebody different, either directly or indirectly, due to a particular characteristic. So, for example, a decision not to offer a female candidate a management role, your belief being she's of childbearing age. Obviously, that's a sort of a conscious thought to treat somebody differently due to a particular characteristic. But there are some sort of views, and I've sort of read and listened to some podcasts about this recently, where actually some people don't like the label unconscious bias, believing that actually there are typically conscious thought processes that might take you through the whole decision-making process. So, for example, if we think about an interview, if there were some unconscious bias in initial consideration of a candidate, that there is actually some conscious thought process and decision making that then takes place before you decided whether to shortlist that candidate for a role or offer that candidate a particular job. So there is some thought that actually, are we not just talking about bias rather than that sort of differentiation between almost sort of conscious discrimination and unconscious bias? So that's an interesting thought, and something that I'm certainly going to sort of explore more in the near future. But I just wanted to pop this slide in and just get you to just look at and think, what do you see when you see those letters bias? What colour are they? Which letters do you sort of prefer the look of? We're sort of naturally programmed to judge something or someone based on how they look before we've even seen how they behave, who they actually are. But if you look very carefully at those letters, actually all 4 letters that spell out the word bias in the image below are actually the same shade of red that's in the banner along the bottom. So when you're able to sort of look at the individual lines, you can actually see that, in fact, each of those letters and the banner at the bottom in the red, they're actually the same colour. So it's just a quick slide just to have a look and say that sometimes, you know, we make snap judgments on things, and actually we need to think a little bit more carefully or take on board a little bit more information before we make certain decisions. So how can this arise in sort of interviews? I've pulled out 4 sort of common types of unconscious bias that can occur in interviews. The first one is affinity bias, and that's sometimes referred to as sort of similarity bias. And that's looking at the sort of an unconscious tendency to sort of gravitate towards people who might have similar background, interests, or beliefs to ourselves. So whilst we might think that we're actively making conscious choices to sort of surround ourselves with people based on their character, the reality is that we aren't very good at being objective, potentially when we're choosing to who we like and who we want to be around. And more often than not, people will tend to gravitate towards others simply because they remind them of themselves. So an example of that in an interview could be, you know, perhaps a candidate who went to the same university as you, or a candidate who went to the same sort of school as yourself. And, you know, in hiring situations, people can often look to then, through that affinity bias, hire people who are similar to themselves. And obviously that means that it can then create a workforce full of people who've got very similar backgrounds, and really kind of destroy or mitigate any issues or processes that are in place to try and encourage diversity amongst an organisation. So that affinity bias can result potentially in us seeking to recruit or recruiting people who are very similar to ourselves, and thus we kind of create a sort of a workforce of similar people. So we reduce the positivity that sort of diverse workforce can bring to us. The halo effect is really about allowing a sort of a positive trait or a number of positive traits to sort of overshadow or distort our overall perception of somebody's capabilities. So, as I say, one area might positively, if we have a positive view of somebody in one particular area, it might influence our feelings about them in overall, or in another area that we're potentially recruiting or asking interview questions on. So it can kind of hinder our ability to think critically about people, and we might overlook or disregard certain flaws in people. So it can give us a kind of a skewed perception where maybe we see that a candidate offers great experience in one area. They don't quite meet the capability that we're looking for in the role in another area, but the halo effect, the positive is overshadowing or distorting our perceptions about their overall performance. So we are, not thinking about their potential lack of capability in a particular role or particular area that we're looking for in the role itself. So confirmation bias is really potentially where we're sort of almost cherry picking information that the candidate's given to support an existing belief. So you're only seeking out information that confirms your beliefs, and you're ignoring or discrediting information that doesn't support them. So in effect, you're kind of looking for evidence that confirms what you already think is true, rather than considering all of the evidence available. So if we think back to that person that we said with affinity bias, it may have been somebody you went to the same university or school with. So you perceive that they're very well educated on that basis. So from there on out, you're only really seeking, or perhaps you only recall after the interview, positive impressions or answers that the individual gave you, and you might sort of gloss over or not recall the not so good answers. So again, you're kind of cherry picking the information that you take from the candidate to confirm the fact that you perceive that they're going to be a great candidate for the role because they've actually been to the same university as yourself. And then stereotyping, and we've obviously all heard that term previously, but where we're kind of ascribing collective characteristics associated with a particular group to every member of that group. So we're kind of discounting individual characteristics. And those kind of judgments that we're making about an individual, they're typically, those that are potentially negative stereotypes, negative judgments that we're making. So for example, you might presume that a woman would prefer a desk job over working outdoors, or you might presume that a woman would have childcare arrangements to prioritise over work. So we're making very generalised judgments about an individual based on the fact that they're a member of a particular group. So in those examples I gave you, the fact that they're female. So those are just some of the common types of unconscious bias that can happen in interviewing. And when we think about the impact of that, it can, as I say, it's those biased impressions are really shaping our judgments, our decisions in regard of candidates. So it can lead to us making unfair evaluations of individuals and their skills and their potential. Means that we could overlook candidates due to those biases. That can also mean, as we've said, that we can have a less diverse and inclusive workforce, particularly if things like affinity bias are creeping in. And obviously, unchecked unconscious bias in interviews can expose the organisation to legal risks and reputational damage as well. And there's also thinking of the impact that it creates for the candidates as well. It can create a very negative impression if an individual feels that they've been, subject to some form of unconscious bias or discrimination in a process. And obviously, when you go through a negative situation, it could be an interview, it could be a sales experience, you typically will tell family and friends about your experience. I know I certainly do. So, you've got to think of that, and that may limit or impact on the talent pool. There's also thinking about things like the use of social media now. It's not just the sort of the Daily Mail test that you have to think of, where you might think if this were a headline in the Daily Mail, what would they say? But actually, it's the impact that somebody can create now through social media, voicing their concerns, potential reputational damage and impact through social media. So there is an impact of unconscious bias in selection processes for individuals, but also organisationally as well. And I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, but I do want to just cover thing about the sort of the framework, the legal framework in this area, particularly focused on the Equality Act. So the Equality Act basically covers the 9 protected characteristics that are on the screen and sets out ways in which it's unlawful to discriminate against those particular protected characteristics. The risk of discrimination can actually occur in recruitment and selection processes. So the individual doesn't have to be an employee or a worker of your organisation to claim that they've been subject to discrimination. It can occur. An individual can raise concerns or claims that they've been discriminated against while looking for a role. So, the legislation covers your employees and workers, it covers job applicants, it covers sort of former employees, and it can also cover sort of contractors or self-employed people if they're hired to personally do the work. So we do have to be mindful that this is an area when we're talking about recruitment and selection where there is a legal framework and there is a risk to an organisation of unconscious bias leading to potentially discriminatory decisions, which could create a risk of claims, reputational damage for the organisation. So before we dive into what can we then do to mitigate this, just a quick break, a quick slide to just get you thinking again. Now, obviously, if anybody wants to pop anything in the chat in terms of answering that question, please feel free to do that. But the question that's on screen basically says, a father and a son are in a car accident. The father dies and the son is rushed to hospital for surgery, but the surgeon says, I can't operate on this boy, he's my son. So the question is then, how's that possible? And I can see some answers are coming in now. Oh, fabulous. Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. So everybody's getting it. So thank you for that. And it's just to get you thinking. And yes, there are a couple of options here. The surgeon could be his mother. It could be that there's a same-sex couple, so that we've still got a father. So that the boy had 2 fathers. So absolutely, yes. But it's just, the first time we read the question, it can quite often be, oh, well, I don't understand how can that happen, because actually it says the father's dead, so sometimes the automatic reaction, and it took me, I've got to admit, I saw this years ago and then I saw it again recently, and it took me 2 reads before I finally went, oh yes, of course. And I think that's because, again, my thought when I sat back and thought about that, it was, well, when I'm watching TV or film or things, it tends to be, in those kind of surgical dramas that a lot of surgeons are male. So I guess, my automatic first thought was, how can the surgeon, the surgeon must be the father. So but it's great to see that obviously you're all kind of taking that step and thinking. So yes, it is very definitely possible. So let's move on and think about those sort of strategies to mitigate that unconscious bias. So we're going to focus really on 3 areas here. We're going to look at awareness, so around acknowledging the fact that unconscious biases exist and their potential impact in the hiring process. We're going to look at standardization, so that's around process, and we're going to talk about actually who's interviewing and panels, and thinking about actually if we have more than one person interviewing, that might help to balance the risk of bias occurring. And actually we can use diverse interview panels to have greater representation, so showing that the panel reflects the sort of diversity of perhaps the role requirements or the organisation, but also diverse panels bring different experiences, knowledge. So again, it's those different sort of perspectives. So we're going to look at all 3 of these, sort of awareness, standardization and panels. thinking about awareness first of all, and awareness likely has two parts. I think there's a wider awareness that biases exist, and sessions such as this today and doing your own kind of research around it can help to understand what are the types of biases that could be out there. And then I think the second part of it, part B, if you like, is almost recognizing and understanding what your own biases are. And I think the first step is to acknowledge that actually we all have biases, because it is based on our experiences, our life to date. We can't avoid that. But what we can do is once we've acknowledged that we've got biases, we can start to then look to try and understand what those biases might be. And that can then, that awareness of those biases that we may have as individuals can help us then in terms of recognizing and being able to be more aware and potentially challenging themselves, challenge them yourself when you become aware of them. In terms of understanding your own sort of biases, there are things that you can do. Quite simple one is something like when you're making a decision, play devil's advocate a bit. What's driving your choices? You could look for patterns, perhaps patterns in your own career decisions, patterns perhaps in recruitment processes that you've been through. If you've been responsible for, say, recruiting your team who are currently reporting into you, are there any patterns that might sort of reveal any sort of biases? But there are also things that you can do. So I've got a link. You'll get a copy of these slides at the end of it, but there's a link on there to the implicit association test. This is a long-term sort of research project that's based at Harvard University. And it sort of aims to measure people's preferences for certain social groups. So that could be a really sort of easy approach that you could take by quickly going through that test to perhaps identify and understand what your own personal biases may be. So I think first step for all of us, and all of us who might be involved in recruitment and selection, is raising our awareness, understanding that biases exist, but then also perhaps trying to do some work to recognise and understand what our own particular biases may be. I'm going to move on to standardisation because that was the second point in a minute, but I just wanted to touch on interview panels. We talked about the fact that actually having more than one person involved in interviewing could in itself help to mitigate bias within interviews, because you've got two people who will be, if it's a panel of two, could be three, might not be four, that might be excessive, but you're going to have more than one person anyway assessing an individual. So that in itself can help to mitigate the risk of bias. And as we've said, there can be real benefits of looking at the diversity of your panel and thinking about that when you're pulling panel members together. But one of the key things around panel, and these are just some real general thoughts, rather than being specific to sort of mitigating bias, but if you're thinking about putting an interview panel together, then make sure that everybody on that panel is familiar with the particular roles. So who will take what role in the panel? We have somebody chair, somebody keep an eye on timing, somebody who'll do those, next steps, close of the interview. But also make sure that the panel, everybody on the panel, is familiar with things like interview questions and scoring criteria ahead of the interview. Share the questions in advance, give people enough time to read them, assign who's going to ask what particular questions. Doing all of that work in advance means that people have got more opportunity to kind of listen and engage to candidates during the interview, rather than perhaps, sort of trying to squeeze through their interview notes to see what am I looking for as a response to this question, who's asking that particular question. So I would always say preparation for an interview panel. So look at pulling an interview panel together. look at the diversity of that interview panel, but making sure that the interview panel is sufficiently prepared, that they are in a place that during the interviews they have a great opportunity to listen and engage with the candidates, rather than trying to, you know, work out any other processes that might need to happen for the interview, or, you know, who's responsible for asking which questions. So make sure that the panel are prepared. Also helpful for any interview panel to you know, go through that awareness step that we've talked about. So that might be some training that you might do, or some coaching that you might do with panel members to talk about and raise their awareness of unconscious bias. And it may be that something like the implicit association test is given to people, so that they have the opportunity to look and understand where their own potential biases might be before they actually start interviewing. But when it comes to kind of your process, there are sort of 3 areas that we recommend standardization. And standardizing your interview process as much as possible can help reduce the impact of bias. Now, typically you'll all, I guess, work with an interview structure. That's a standardized process. And obviously you'll be aware that traditionally that'll be a sort of a welcome, the questions that the panel will want to ask of the candidate, opportunity for the candidate to ask questions, and then that opportunity to go through with the candidate what the next steps are and to bring the interview to a close. So that's really great to have a sort of a standardized interview structure that helps the panel in terms of understanding what they're doing in each of those particular interviews. But for the questions, we do recommend that you do have structured questions that are consistently asked. So in that situation, what you would typically do is prepare the interview questions in advance. Now, for the interview questions, you know, you will more often than not be recruiting for a role where you may have developed a job description or a role description and a person specification. And the person specification will typically set out things like, you know, qualifications, experience, it might be skills, abilities that you've identified are required for the role. They might be essential, they might be desirable, you might have split them out into those categories. But you said this is really what the person needs to have to be able to perform at the level that's expected of the role. So the whole of your sort of recruitment and selection process should be geared really around that person specification and making sure that you're testing the individual's capability for those points. So your interview questions can really be formed by hopefully your person specification. But whatever questions that you're asking, make sure that they are structured. So you're asking the same questions of the same candidate. And we do recommend that they're asked in a consistent order of all candidates, and that you use the same sort of interview format, the duration, the environment, for all the candidates to have a sort of a fair comparison. So you're sort of comparing apples and apples rather than apples and oranges. But also make sure that you really avoid trying to ask irrelevant or personal questions that might trigger bias or discrimination. Now, what that doesn't mean is that if you've got structured questions, it doesn't mean that you can't ask follow-up or probing questions, because we all know in interview situations, people can be nervous. There might be that they only answer partial question. They might use the very British, well, we did this, we did that, in their response to a question, and you want to understand exactly what the individual did. So you certainly would want to, in those situations, ask follow-up questions of the individual. You might even have some probing questions already available on your interview pro forma. So you may have already identified, if you've asked somebody to give you an indication of, you know, tell us about a time when you had to work with an individual where there were performance concerns, as an example. And if perhaps they didn't tell you the full outcome of that, So obviously you might have a follow-up question that might be, so what was the outcome, or what was the result of that? Did the performance improve? So absolutely, you're able to ask follow-up questions, but it's really just ensuring that those initial questions are structured, consistently asked, and that you avoid asking anything that's sort of irrelevant or personal that might sort of trigger bias or discrimination. And as we said, determine who's going to ask which questions before you begin, and use the same sort of format and duration as well. Standardization is also really important when it comes to evaluation, and having a sort of a clear and consistent criteria for evaluating candidates as well. So I'm going to move forward into an example of that. And if you have a sort of a predefined marking criteria, if you like, a scoring criteria for when a candidate answers interview questions, then that way all candidates again are being judged against the same standard. So this can be really helpful way of mitigating bias by having that kind of predefined marking criteria. So again, the way that you're evaluating candidates is consistent. The key is the sort of standardization and consistency. So there's an example of a scoring criteria on a slide where you might score from 1 to 5 in terms of an individual and the response they've given you to a particular question. I wouldn't save all of your scoring for the very end of all of your interviews, as it's going to be very difficult to remember individuals' responses, and you might be another bias may play up there, which is almost like recency bias, which is you're more likely to clearly remember the responses from the last candidate that you saw in the day to the candidate that you saw at the start of the day. So I don't recommend that you do any scoring of candidates all at the end of the day. My approach that I take is I like to score at the end of each interview when the information is sort of fresh in my head. So I won't score at the end of each question, but I'll score at the end of the interview all of the questions that have been asked of that particular candidate. Some people may like to score at the end of each question. That's fine. But what I would say is don't wait until the end of the day. If you've seen 4, 5, 6, 8 candidates, you're going to struggle to score all of those candidates effectively if you do that at the end of the day. And what I recommend where you're using interview panels is that interviewers should assign scores, their own scores for each candidate independently before they come together to discuss them as a group. Discussing the candidates before you score. Some interviewers are maybe more likely to be influenced, by others' opinions, and potentially if you've got, depending on who's on your interview panel, but potentially by the opinion of the most senior person on the panel. So it's helpful to have a standardized evaluation criteria for each interview panel member to do those scores independently before the panel then comes together as a group to perhaps discuss their scores and discuss their candidates. And what I like to do when we come forward for that sort of discussion part is to really just very quickly collate all of the scores. So something like a very simple Excel spreadsheet, as you see on the slide here, where you can pop in all of the assessors' scores for each of the individuals. And that gives you an indication at that point as to who the panel have scored the highest. Typically, scoring the highest would mean that they meet more of the criteria that are on the person specification. So that should typically show that that's the candidate who best meets the person specification. But what that does is it kind of gives you an insight as well. You can have a look at that when you see all the scores on one sheet. You can really identify if there are any significant differences in scores, which may be where the panel wants to discuss. Now, you might always have differences, slight differences in the way that assessors score. I know my own experiences is I tend to score slightly lower than other panel members. That's been my sort of experience. I guess I must be more of a stingier scorer. But if that's consistent, so perhaps if I consistently score a candidate 1 or 2 points less than another assessor, but it's consistent, then that might be something that you're not necessarily concerned about. But if you've got wild sort of discrepancies, you know, so somebody has consistently scored a candidate as answering at level 5 for each of the questions, and somebody else has scored at level 2, you know, then that seems to be a much bigger discrepancy that may want to have some discussion to understand why those differences have occurred, and to see what the panel want to do about that. And I think if you start to see any of those differences, that's when you need to sort of start having these discussions. And I think if you are concerned about you know, questions or scores that people have issued, and you think you might need to challenge, then I think it's about understanding. I think the first step that you take is if you notice those score differences. So if you see on this you know, this matrix that there's significant difference, the first step is obviously to discuss that, to talk about that, to understand what are the reasons behind those differences in decisions. It may be that things are resolved at that point. It may well be that somebody wasn't particularly paying attention during an answer to that question, so they missed something that the other interviewer is then able, through, you know, or other panel members are then able to sort of to fill in. So it could be something that's simple as that. If it becomes a concern that there may be challenge, there may be bias, sorry, that's shown, then obviously that can be quite a sort of a difficult conversation in terms of discussing that. Show my age here by putting this picture on the slide. What I would initially hope is that identifying points where bias can happen, such as, you know, the interviews, educating panel members, going through sessions such as this, can help mitigate that risk of bias happening. But if you do think that there is bias, you know, once you've had that initial discussion, if you do believe that there is an element of bias, then I think it can be about talking to the individual, perhaps suggesting alternative perspectives, inviting the individual to think differently by suggesting those alternative perspectives. As we said, ask probing questions to help the person consider the different perspective. You know, have an inclusive mindset when you go into these conversations in terms of thinking about how to discuss bias with an individual. But it could be that something like the EEC model of feedback could be helpful in terms of channeling this kind of conversation, because I always think if you're potentially challenging what may be an unconscious bias, that could end up feeling like a very personal conversation to have with somebody who you may not know particularly well, who may be in a more senior role to yourselves. So that EEC model of feedback, which is about explain, effect, and change, can be a helpful tool here. Not the whole process, but I think potentially, particularly the explain and the effect. So if you've not come across that model of feedback before, the explain is really about giving the individual, setting the scene, the scenario, what's actually happened. So, you know, that would be quite specific about, you know, where they may have scored particularly low or particularly high for a candidate. The effect is then thinking of the impact. So in this kind of scenario, you could use the sort of the alternate views, the alternate perspectives that other panel members have, and look at the impact of making the wrong sort of decision in terms of hiring decisions from this, the impact that that might have on individuals, the organisation. And look to use that as the sort of jumping off point to then have the sort of more open questions to sort of understand why the individual first came to that decision, and perhaps to help them suggest those alternative perspectives and perhaps help them to move through that conversation by considering those different perspectives. So I think it's really about understanding why they've scored somebody as they have. And if there's still a concern that the panel has at that point, it's about using something like an EEC model that can help you frame a conversation to get the individual to understand the impact of their decision, and to look at how you can help them to consider different perspectives, to then see if that makes a change or has any impact in terms of the overall decision that the individual's going to make. But hopefully these steps of raising awareness, standardization, using interview panels, will all help to mitigate the risk of that happening in the first instance. Simple comment here about record keeping is just to say that obviously, you know, if you're using interview pro formas to take notes of your interviews, make sure that you keep those, collate them, so that if there are any risks or concerns regarding process, that information remains available. Typically we recommend that they're retained for up to 6 months. So just in terms of sort of conclusion, what we hope that mitigating unconscious bias can do is help obviously mitigate risks of legal challenges or claims, attract sort of fresh, diverse talent into the organisation, result in fairer decision making, greater inclusivity, and obviously that sort of greater diversity in the workforce can really encourage creativity, innovation. It can help in terms of levels of productivity, can obviously support organisational policies and processes and intentions when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and it can potentially give a sort of a competitive edge to organisations and create an unbiased culture. So lots and lots of real positive impacts in terms of you know, mitigating unconscious bias in recruitment and selection, and particularly interviewing. Going to come on and ask if there's any questions, and I know questions have been put. We ask for questions, or questions can go using the Q&A button, but while just waiting for questions to come through, I'm just going to pop this slide up as well, which is just really various ways that you can connect with us at Roots. Our website address is there, our phone number's there, but also you can connect with us through LinkedIn, through Facebook, and I haven't put the new X. I can't get over the change from X to or from Twitter to X, but we're also on X, as I suppose it is now. So those are various ways that you can connect with us, and as I say, through our website you can access a range of those sort of free resources. So I'll just come back to my colleague Charlotte and just ask if we've got any questions that have been raised.
Yeah, so there's been lots of discussions actually in the chat, which is fantastic. We've got a few questions, but if you have got any other questions, if you could pop those in the Q&A, that would be fantastic. So first question we've got, what is your view on sharing interview questions in advance from an EDI point of view? Have we lost you, Alison? I think we've just lost Alison. I'll see if she'll be back in just a moment. I'll just be one moment.
I'm here. Sorry.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes. Oh, apologies for that. I meant to hit unshare and instead I hit leave, honestly.
No problem. Did you hear that question?
I didn't, sorry.
Sorry, I have just, okay, so there's lots of questions in the chat. Let's just go back to that one. Really sorry, I have completely lost where I was.
Oh no, that's fine.
Okay. So sorry, Alison, carry on.
Sorry, I've just seen a question from Allegra. I was just going backwards, which was just about, has anybody ever asked for I've just lost the question now. A panel as an observer. Has anybody ever had an extra person on a panel as an observer, not asking questions but observing the panel? Yeah, I've done that previously, where I've sat as an observer. It can be helpful sometimes. I think you have to, if you're doing that, clearly explain to the candidate so they're aware that that's not a person who's involved in the process. They're merely observing the process, and obviously ensure that the panel don't ask for their input on the decisions. Yes,
Thank
sorry,
you.
Charlotte.
I've kind of found it, so we're back. So what's your view on sharing interview questions in advance from an EDI point of view?
There are, I think there's more discussion about that. I think some people are doing that. I think it can be a reasonable adjustment. So you may have somebody who perhaps for a reason of a disability asks, and you may agree that it's reasonable to share. My sort of concern that I've had previously with that is that it could allow candidates to prepare responses to questions that aren't necessarily perhaps real or reflective of what they've done. They've kind of created a textbook answer. However, with the rise of artificial intelligence and sort of things that I've seen of people using AI to, in the moment, create a response for them, then I guess that is, I guess that kind of, mitigates that risk slightly, in the fact that you could have it in live interviews now where people are giving you more textbook answers because actually they're using AI to help create the answers there and then in front of them. So I think it can be a helpful tool. I think if it's something that you're going to do, either do it as a reasonable adjustment for an individual or do it consistently as part of your processes. I wouldn't pick and choose which roles to use that for, if that helps.
Thank you. Next one then. So we've got, would you recommend probing questions are consistent?
Not necessarily, no. You can have, what I will sometimes do on questions is create a probing question that might be one that I recognise might be useful for that particular question. But I think if it will very much depend on the original answer that the candidate has given to you. So I don't think that they have to be consistent, because as I say, it may be that the individual has just not completely answered your question, and what you're doing is giving them the opportunity to give you the full answer. That then means that you're still comparing full answers from all candidates when you're doing the scoring.
Thank you. We've got one here. So Nikki had an occasion where the person that scored the highest, there was a person that scored the highest, sorry, but when they had a discussion, they felt that feel there is something that means that in their gut instinct they're not the best person for the role. So if you had that before, how do you go about that?
Quite often there will be discussions around sort of fit for a role, fit within an organisation, and I think that certainly needs to be part of a decision-making process. What I would be cautious about is when you're talking about sort of gut instincts and when you can't articulate or reason why that is the decision that you're making. You have to be really clear. And I think in situations like that, if it were the highest scoring individual candidate, perhaps in the interview, I would suggest that the panel would have to make clear and record the decisions, why the decision was taken not to appoint that person, what the reasons for those were. And I think they've got to be reasonable, measured decisions that aren't related to any sort of form of potential bias or discrimination. So I would avoid doing it on gut instinct. I think it has to be something that is reasonable, measured, thought through, and something that you can articulate a particular reason why, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Mark asking about asking candidates specific questions about gaps in their CV and things like that. So
and whether that's allowed
yeah,
almost.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Again, as long as the question that you're asking is, broad enough and not discriminatory in the way that you sort of frame it. So obviously, if you had a female candidate in front of you and you said, "Oh, I can see there's a gap in your CV," I presume you were off having a family at that time. That's going to be sort of discriminatory. But if it's a general question that's like, "Oh, could you explain the gap in your work experience, the dates from whenever it was to," that's a general question. You're not asking anything that's discriminatory or unlawful in that sense.
thank you. And do you know if there are any legalities of recording interviews? So you can sort of play it back.
Um, Off the top of my head, the big thing would be around data protection. So I think in advance you would need consent from all parties that they would be happy for the meeting to be recorded, and you would need to think about the processing of that information. So where is that going to be stored? How long is it going to be kept? Who's going to have access to it? And make sure that thinking about things like deletion of the information. So, for example, when I talked about the records for interviews, said we'd recommend they're kept for 6 months. Typically, that's because that gives you sufficient time for there to be any kind of claim brought through, perhaps an employment tribunal for discrimination. So you'd need to think about, okay, so what's the retention period that you'd want if you had any sort of recordings, and you'd need to make sure that they were in line with data protection legislation, only kept for the purpose that they were intended for a period of time. For something like an interview recording, if you've got notes of an interview, I wouldn't necessarily see that you would be sort of on the right side of data protection law by keeping that recording. I think you'd probably only keep the recording for the purpose of decision making. If you've got notes, you'd then use those, keep those as your longer term sort of data information for sort of 6 months, and you'd probably want to destroy the video or delete the video recording. So it's data protection, really.
Thank you. Are there any sort of particular websites or reading that you can point everybody to for further knowledge or understanding of unconscious bias?
I will have a look. I would say have a look at that implicit, the IA test, the Harvard one, implicit. I can't think what it's called now. But I would have a look at that test, and I will I'll have a think and see if there's anywhere. I'm sure that there is, because there's so much information around this. So I'll have a look, and in terms of sending out the slides, we'll pop something in there in the cover email as well if there's anything we'd specifically signpost you to.
Thank you. We've got a couple more. So do you think sorry, if someone isn't appointable due to a lack of experience, is it insulting to offer them volunteer work to build their skills and encourage them to apply should a role come up again?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think in that respect, the approach that you want to take is fine. I think it's the way that you communicate that to the individual. And I think being able to give them developmental feedback as part of the reason why you're not offering them the role, and then perhaps explaining to them how something like a volunteer position might help them build the experience that they need. So I think there's nothing wrong with that approach. It's more about, I guess, how you communicate that to the individual so that it's positively received, really.
Thank you. And do you think that having CV-less applications can be useful in reducing bias in recruitment? Or if CVs are necessary, can you recommend any methods to reduce the bias?
Methods to reduce bias in CVs tends to be through the use of anonymisation. And that can either be, I mean, that could be the same if you did application forms. That could be either quite a laborious administrative task to anonymise information before it goes to the shortlisters. So it's really anonymisation for shortlisting purposes. Alternatively, there is some technology that's available, some applicant tracking systems, if you use those, where they have anonymisation as part of that process. So they will anonymise the application so that the shortlister can't see things like the individual's name, date of birth, anything that might be particularly identifying. It would depend how far the sort of anonymization goes. I don't know whether tools that are available would do things such as, exclude dates from CVs, because obviously dates you can generally work out somebody's age, I guess. But there are anonymization is the biggest thing, and that can be done through specific tools like applicant tracking systems, or it could be an administrative job to anonymize. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got one final question. So certain industries have a lack of diversity, and this could paint a picture of bias in interviews. Could this be an opportunity for positive action to encourage more diverse candidates are shortlisted?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, positive, there's a difference between positive action and positive discrimination. Positive action is lawful, positive discrimination is not. Positive discrimination would be where you said, okay, I've got two candidates who could both do the job. One's a white male, one's a black male. We don't have much diversity in terms of race in the organisation, so we're gonna actively make the decision to choose the black candidate. That's unlawful. But positive action, where you're encouraging people to, you might see things in job adverts that say, we actively encourage members of, and it might be a particular group, a particular characteristic, particular race, ethnicity, etc. So you might see that in the adverts. There are some organisations where they might provide some additional support or coaching, perhaps in terms of how to apply for a job as parts of sort of positive action. So positive action is really about encouraging the sort of applications. There are other organisations that do more around positive action, typically them as a third party. So it may well be that they're providing training to individuals to get into a particular, perhaps sector, and you can work with them to perhaps have trainees as part of that. So yeah, positive action is fine. Positive discrimination is where it becomes unlawful.
Thank you. We have just had one further question. I know we're running over a little bit, so
sneak it in.
Thank you. So we don't currently anonymise CVs. Is this suggested going forward?
I mean, it's helpful in terms of mitigating risk. If that's something that you're concerned about, a risk of bias, it's helpful to help mitigate that risk, because then the shortlisters don't have that personal information for that to impact on their sort of shortlisting decisions. I think probably what you might do is do some initial, sort of research review of your recruitment processes to date, the outcomes, and determine whether you think that might be useful going forward. But it certainly can help mitigate risk, because you're removing all personal information from the shortlisters' domain, so that can't influence their shortlisting decisions.
Thank you, Alison. That's I think we've covered all the questions, but obviously if we've missed anything, please do email us. Our best contact email is info@rootshr.org.uk. But I think we've covered them all.
Thank you, Charlotte, for helping with that. As we said, we'll send out the notes, the slides, and I will just think if there's anywhere that I would signpost you to outside of that IA test, and we'll include that in the covering email. Thank you all. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave appropriately this time, as intended, rather than before. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.